The spark of a hero. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Crescent Heights, a small, tight-knit Midwest town known for its idyllic streets and bustling community events. But beneath its picturesque surface, the town carried a weight of unspoken tension, a divide that ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. Marcus Harris walked the familiar streets, his military boots echoing faintly against the pavement. A Black Army veteran, Marcus had served with distinction, surviving deployments that most people could only imagine. Yet, in the town he called home, he often felt like an outsider. The flag he'd fought for flew high above every porch, but its promises of freedom and equality often felt hollow. Tonight was no different. Marcus had just finished a long day at the local youth center, where he mentored at-risk kids, sharing stories of resilience and discipline. He believed in leading by example, and his presence alone inspired many. To the kids, he was Uncle Marcus, the gentle giant who could turn the most chaotic classroom into a haven of learning and respect. But to others in town, those who saw only his skin color, he was someone to be wary of, a man who didn't belong. As he strolled toward his modest apartment, a cruiser pulled up slowly beside him. The police car's lights weren't flashing, but Marcus could feel the tension rising before a word was spoken. He glanced over, seeing Officer Tom Ridley behind the wheel. Ridley had a reputation, a hard-nosed cop with a chip on his shoulder and a history of run-ins with minorities. "Hey, you there?" Ridley barked, stepping out of the car. The officer's hand hovered near his holstered weapon, a move that wasn't lost on Marcus. Marcus stopped, his calm demeanor betraying the unease bubbling inside him. "Evening, officer," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "What are you doing out here?" Ridley demanded, his eyes scanning Marcus as though he were a suspect in a crime yet to be committed. "Just heading home," Marcus replied, gesturing to the grocery bag in his hand. Inside were a few essentials, a loaf of bread, some milk, and canned beans. He'd picked them up on his way back from the center. Ridley's lip curled. "Funny. I don't recall this being your side of town." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Didn't know there were boundaries. I've lived here for years." The air grew thick with tension. A few passers-by paused, sensing trouble but hesitant to intervene. Ridley stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "Let me see some ID." Marcus sighed, reaching into his pocket. He'd been through this before, too many times, in fact. He handed over his ID, watching as Ridley inspected it with exaggerated scrutiny. "You're military." The officer sneered, noticing the veteran marker on the card. "Bet you think that makes you special, huh?" "I don't think I'm special," Marcus said evenly. "I'm just a man trying to get home." But Ridley wasn't listening. He'd already decided how this encounter would go. "Turn around," he snapped, hands behind her head. "For what?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. "What have I done?" "You're obstructing an investigation," Ridley growled, reaching for his handcuffs. "What investigation?" Marcus protested, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just walking home." Before Marcus could react, Ridley grabbed him, twisting his arm behind his back. The grocery bag fell to the ground, its contents spilling across the pavement. Marcus tried to keep his composure, but the force of the officer's grip sent a sharp pain shooting through his shoulder. "Stop resisting," Ridley shouted, his voice echoing down the street. "I'm not resisting," Marcus exclaimed, his body tense as he tried to avoid escalating the situation further. But Ridley wasn't interested in de-escalation. With a brutal shove, the officer forced Marcus to the ground. His head hit the pavement with a sickening thud. The world blurred, and Marcus felt himself slipping into unconsciousness. The last thing he saw was a crowd gathering, faces filled with shock, fear, and anger. Among them was a young boy from the youth center, tears streaming down his face as he cried, "Uncle Marcus, stop hurting him." Marcus didn't hear the sirens of the ambulance that arrived minutes later. He didn't see the medics carefully lift his body onto a stretcher or the furious debates breaking out among the onlookers. For him, the world had gone dark. Across town, Marcus's son, Jordan Harris, was deep in his studies. A third-year law student, Jordan had inherited his father's sense of justice and determination. His textbooks were spread out across the table, annotated with colorful tabs and scribbled notes. He was preparing for a mock trial competition, determined to hone his skills to perfection. His phone buzzed, interrupting his focus. It was a text from one of the kids at the youth center. "Mr. Jordan, something happened to your dad. The police hurt him bad." Jordan's heart sank. He called the number immediately, his voice trembling. "What do you mean? Where is he?" The child's voice was shaky. "The ambulance took him. He wasn't moving. They said he hit his head." Jordan didn't wait for more details. Grabbing his coat, he bolted out the door, his mind racing with a mix of fear and anger. His father, a man who had faced bullets and bombs overseas, was now lying in a hospital bed because of a senseless act of brutality. At the hospital, Jordan found his father in the ICU, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred with clinical precision. Marcus's face was bruised, his head wrapped in bandages. Jordan's chest tightened as he took in the sight. "What happened to him?" he demanded, his voice shaking as he addressed a nurse. The nurse looked sympathetic but hesitant. "He was brought in by ambulance. The report says he had an altercation with a police officer. He's in a coma now. We're monitoring his condition closely." Jordan clenched his fists, his mind replaying every conversation he'd ever had with his father about the realities of being black in America. His father had warned him, prepared him for moments like this. But nothing could have prepared Jordan for the sight of his strong, resilient father lying helpless in a hospital bed. Jordan sat beside his father, gripping his hand. "I'll get justice for you, Dad," he whispered, his voice resolute. "No matter what it takes." Unbeknownst to Jordan, this moment was the beginning of a battle that would shake the foundations of Crescent Heights and beyond. The spark of a hero had ignited, and its light would shine far and wide. A son's mission. Jordan Harris sat in the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of machines echoing in his ears. The sight of his father, Marcus, lying unconscious with tubes and wires attached to his body, fueled a fire within him. Marcus wasn't just a father. He was a symbol of strength and resilience. Now, seeing him broken, reduced to silence by a senseless act of violence, was almost too much to bear. Jordan's hands shook as he pulled out his laptop, determined to understand exactly what had happened. His father's character was beyond reproach, but Jordan knew how these situations often played out. The narrative could quickly be twisted against the victim. He wouldn't let that happen to his dad. The first thing Jordan did was check the news. Local media had already begun reporting on the incident, but the accounts were vague and skewed. "Altercation between a man and police officer leaves one injured," the headline read. An altercation. Jordan gritted his teeth. His father wasn't the type to pick fights, especially not with police. The articles portrayed the situation as if Marcus had been a threat, but Jordan knew better. He scrolled through comments on social media, seeing a mix of outrage and skepticism. Community outcry. As the news spread, the community began to rally. Marcus wasn't just another man to them. He was a mentor, a protector, and a friend. At the youth center, the kids who had looked up to Marcus couldn't contain their emotions. Some of them, barely teenagers, were already organizing a small protest in front of the police station. They painted signs with messages like, "Justice for Mr. Marcus," and "Stop police brutality." Word of mouth spread quickly. Parents, teachers, and local activists joined the cause, sharing stories of how Marcus had touched their lives. He wasn't just a war hero, he was a hero in their community. But as the crowd grew, so did the police presence. Officers in riot gear stood guard outside the station, their faces emotionless as the chants of "Justice now" echoed through the streets. Jordan, still at the hospital, received a call from an old family friend, Pastor Greg. The pastor had been a close confidant of Marcus and often worked with him on community projects. "Jordan," Greg said, his voice heavy with concern, "we need you to come down here. The people are asking for a leader, and you're the best one we got." Jordan hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker or a community organizer. At least he didn't think of himself that way. But Greg's words stuck with him. He had been studying law to fight for justice. Now, justice needed him sooner than he expected. The first rally. When Jordan arrived at the protest, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't for him personally. They barely knew him, but for what he represented. He was Marcus's son, the torchbearer of his legacy. Standing on the steps of the police station, Jordan took the microphone handed to him by Pastor Greg. His heart pounded as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He thought of his father lying in that hospital bed, fighting for his life. "My father, Marcus Harris, is a man of honor," Jordan began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "He served this country with pride. He came home to serve this community with love. And now, because of one man's prejudice, he's lying in a hospital bed." The crowd erupted into cheers of agreement, but Jordan raised his hand to quiet them. "This isn't just about my dad," he continued. "This is about every person who has been mistreated, silenced, or ignored because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that allows this to happen over and over again." Tears welled in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. "We will not be silent. We will not stop until justice is served, not just for my father, but for everyone." The crowd roared, their voices united in a single, powerful chant: "Justice for Marcus." Uncovering the truth. After the rally, Jordan didn't waste any time. He knew words alone wouldn't bring justice. He needed evidence. He began reaching out to anyone who might have witnessed the incident. His first lead came from a local teenager, Malik, who had been skateboarding nearby when the confrontation occurred. "I saw the whole thing," Malik said, his voice shaky but determined. "Your dad didn't do anything wrong. That cop just started yelling at him for no reason." "Did you record it?" Jordan asked, hope flickering in his chest. Malik nodded and handed over his phone. The video was shaky but clear enough to show Officer Ridley shoving Marcus without provocation. The footage captured the exact moment Marcus hit the pavement, his head striking the ground with a sickening sound. Jordan's stomach churned as he watched it, but he knew this evidence could change everything. With Malik's permission, Jordan uploaded the video to social media. Within hours, it went viral. News outlets picked it up, and suddenly, the narrative shifted. Marcus wasn't a suspect in an altercation. He was a victim of police brutality. The hashtag Justice for Marcus began trending nationwide. Pressure mounts. The video brought attention from prominent civil rights organizations and national media outlets. Legal teams reached out, offering their support. One of them, a high-profile civil rights attorney named Claire Bennett, met with Jordan personally. "You've done incredible work so far," Claire said, her tone both professional and warm. "But this fight is far from over. The police department will do everything in their power to protect their own. We need to be ready." Jordan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He wasn't just fighting for his father. He was fighting against a system designed to shield those in power. Claire's team filed a civil lawsuit against the police department and demanded an independent investigation into Officer Ridley's actions. The department, under immense public pressure, placed Ridley on administrative leave, but the community wasn't satisfied. They wanted accountability, not a slap on the wrist. A family divided. As Jordan dove deeper into the fight for justice, he faced resistance, not just from the system, but from within his own family. Marcus's sister, Aunt Denise, had always been wary of pushing too hard against authority. She worried that Jordan's activism might put the family in danger. "Jordan, I know you mean well," she said during a tense conversation, "but these things have a way of backfiring. Do you really think they'll let you win?" Jordan's jaw tightened. "If I don't fight, who will?" Dad didn't raise me to back down from what's right." Denise sighed, her eyes filled with both fear and love. "Just be careful. A movement is born." Despite the challenges, Jordan pressed on. He partnered with local activists to organize more rallies and educational workshops. They held town halls to discuss police reform and created safe spaces for people to share their own stories of injustice. What started as a fight for Marcus became a movement for systemic change. As Jordan stood on the front lines, he began to see himself not just as his father's son, but as a leader in his own right. The weight of the mission was heavy, but he carried it with pride, knowing that every step forward was a step closer to justice, not just for Marcus, but for an entire community longing for change. The hidden truth. Jordan Harris sat at his makeshift desk in his father's modest apartment, surrounded by stacks of paper, open law textbooks, and sticky notes scribbled with leads. The viral video of Officer Ridley's attack on his father had ignited a national conversation, but Jordan knew that outrage alone wouldn't secure justice. If he wanted to hold the police department accountable, he needed more than public support. He needed irrefutable evidence, and something told him that Marcus's case was just the tip of the iceberg, a whisper in the dark. Late one night, Jordan received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his heart racing with a mix of curiosity and dread. Jordan Harris. The voice on the other end was low, cautious. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name's not important," the caller replied. "Let's just say I work on the inside." Jordan sat up straighter, gripping the phone tightly. "Go on. I've seen what's happening to your father, and I can't stay quiet anymore," the caller said. "Ridley isn't the only problem. There's a network, a system in place to protect guys like him." "What do you mean?" Jordan pressed. "There's a file," the caller explained. "An internal record of complaints and investigations that never saw the light of day. It's buried deep in the system, but if you can get your hands on it, you'll understand just how bad it is." Before Jordan could ask more questions, the line went dead. Chasing leads. The next morning, Jordan shared the cryptic phone call with Claire Bennett, the civil rights attorney leading the lawsuit. She wasn't surprised. "Every department has skeletons in its closet," Claire said, her tone grim. "But if there's a file like this, it could be a game changer. We need to find someone who can access it." Jordan reached out to community contacts, eventually connecting with Maria Delgado, a former administrative clerk who had worked at the Crescent Heights Police Department. Maria had quit years ago, fed up with the corruption she had witnessed, but fear had kept her silent. When Jordan and Claire met with Maria, she was visibly nervous, wringing her hands as she spoke. "I don't know if I can help," Maria said. "Even now, I'm scared of what they'll do if they find out I talked." "We'll protect you," Claire assured her. "But the truth needs to come out." Maria hesitated, then finally nodded. "There's a server at the station where they keep internal records. If what you're looking for exists, it'll be there. But accessing it won't be easy." A risky plan. Jordan and Claire devised a strategy. They filed a formal request for the department's internal records, citing the lawsuit as justification. Predictably, the request was denied, with the department citing sensitive and confidential information as the reason. But Jordan wasn't deterred. While Claire worked on legal avenues to force transparency, Jordan decided to dig deeper. He reached out to Malik, the teenager who had recorded the initial video, and together, they created an online campaign encouraging whistleblowers to come forward anonymously. The campaign worked better than Jordan had hoped. Within days, he received dozens of tips, many of which painted a damning picture of the Crescent Heights Police Department. Stories of excessive force, racial profiling, and fabricated charges flooded in, each one more horrifying than the last. One email stood out. It was from a retired officer named John Mercer, who had served in the department for over 2 decades before quitting in frustration. His email was short but powerful. "If you want the truth, meet me at the old diner on 5th Street. Midnight. Come alone." Unveiling the cover-up. Jordan arrived at the diner as instructed, his pulse quickening as he spotted Mercer in a corner booth. The retired officer looked weary, his eyes shadowed by years of guilt and regret. "You're brave for coming here," Mercer said, motioning for Jordan to sit. "But bravery won't be enough. You need to know what you're up against." For the next hour, Mercer recounted his experiences in the department. He described how complaints against officers were routinely buried, investigations were sabotaged, and victims were silenced through intimidation or settlements. "The worst part," Mercer said, his voice trembling, "is that it's not just a few bad apples. The whole tree is rotten. They have a code. Protect the blue. It's not about justice. It's about survival." Mercer handed Jordan a USB drive. "This is all I could gather before I left. It's not everything, but it's a start." Jordan thanked Mercer, his hands shaking as he pocketed the drive. "Why are you helping me?" Mercer sighed. "Because your father is a good man, and because I've been a coward for too long." The breaking point. Back at Claire's office, Jordan plugged in the USB drive, his stomach in knots as the files loaded. What he saw was worse than he had imagined. Dozens of internal memos detailing dismissed complaints, falsified reports, and even emails from higher-ups instructing officers to control the narrative in controversial cases. One case caught Jordan's attention, a complaint filed by a young black man named Andrew Phillips, who had accused Ridley of excessive force years earlier. The file showed that Andrew had been coerced into withdrawing his complaint after being threatened with false charges. The name sent a chill down Jordan's spine. Andrew was a volunteer at the youth center, someone Marcus had mentored closely. Jordan immediately called Andrew, who confirmed the story in a shaky voice. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," Andrew said. "But if you're fighting this, I'll stand with you." Armed with this new evidence, Jordan and Claire filed a motion to expand the lawsuit to include broader claims of systemic corruption. The department's legal team scrambled to contain the fallout, but the tide was turning. The first crack in the armor. The revelation sent shockwaves through Crescent Heights. Local news outlets that had initially dismissed the case as an isolated incident began airing in-depth exposes. Activists from neighboring towns joined the protests, swelling the crowds to unprecedented numbers. Even some officers within the department, disillusioned by the leadership's actions, began speaking out. Under mounting pressure, the town's mayor announced an independent audit of the police department, but the community demanded more. They wanted arrests, resignations, and real change. Meanwhile, Officer Ridley's personal life began to unravel. The viral video and subsequent revelations made him a pariah in the community. He was placed under investigation, but Jordan knew it wasn't enough. Ridley wasn't just a rogue officer, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. A glimpse of hope. As Jordan walked through the crowd of protesters one evening, a young girl tugged at his sleeve. She couldn't have been older than 10, her wide eyes filled with admiration. "Are you gonna save your dad?" she asked softly. Jordan knelt to her level, his heart swelling with determination. "I'm going to do everything I can," he said, "not just for my dad, but for all of us." The girl nodded, her face lighting up with a small smile. "Then I'll keep praying for you." That night, as Jordan stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a sea of supporters, he realized that this fight was no longer just about Marcus. It was about justice, accountability, and the hope for a better future. And for the first time, he felt the weight of that responsibility as something more than a burden. It was his purpose, the fight for change. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jordan Harris stood at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding as he glanced at the rows of people behind him. The room was packed. Journalists scribbled notes. Community members sat with arms crossed in quiet solidarity, and family members of past victims of police brutality looked on with hope and trepidation. This was no ordinary trial. This was the moment where a community's fight for justice met the cold, unyielding machinery of the legal system. At the defense table sat a team of polished attorneys hired by the Crescent Heights Police Department. Their lead counsel, Andrew Wallace, was known for his ruthless tactics and ability to dismantle even the most damning evidence. Beside him, Officer Ridley sat stiffly, his face a mask of indifference, though his clenched jaw betrayed the pressure he was under. Jordan had prepared for this moment relentlessly. Guided by Claire Bennett and her legal team, he had pored over case law, dissected depositions, and practiced his arguments until they became second nature. But no amount of preparation could quell the gravity of what was at stake. The opening salvo. Claire Bennett began with her opening statement, her voice firm and commanding. She painted a vivid picture of Marcus Harris's life, a decorated veteran, a beloved mentor, and a father whose only crime was walking home that fateful night. What happened to Marcus Harris is not an isolated incident, Claire said, her gaze sweeping across the jury. It is the result of a culture of unchecked power, where certain officers believe they can act without consequence. Today, we will show you the truth, through evidence, through testimony, and through the courage of those who have come forward. Wallace's response was as sharp as expected. He framed Ridley's actions as a necessary response to a perceived threat, leaning heavily on the narrative of split-second decisions and the challenges of policing. This case is not about systemic issues, Wallace declared. It's about a single officer making a difficult judgment in a tense situation. The plaintiffs want to vilify an entire department, but I urge you to focus on the facts. The evidence unfolds. Over the next several days, the courtroom became a battlefield of arguments and counterarguments. Jordan watched intently as Claire presented the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. The video footage from Malik's phone was a key piece, showing Ridley's aggression and Marcus's peaceful demeanor. Maria Delgado, the former administrative clerk, testified about the department's efforts to bury complaints, her voice trembling as she recounted the intimidation tactics she had faced. Andrew Phillips, the youth center volunteer, took the stand next, detailing his harrowing encounter with Ridley years earlier. "I was just walking home," Andrew said, his voice cracking. "And he stopped me, said I looked suspicious. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. He shoved me against a wall and said he'd arrest me for resisting if I didn't shut up." Wallace attempted to discredit Andrew, bringing up minor infractions from his past, but Claire objected. The judge sustained it, reminding the court that Andrew's history was irrelevant to the case at hand. The department fights back. Behind the scenes, the police department was scrambling. Leaked emails revealed their attempts to control the narrative, including instructions to officers to remain silent and statements designed to paint Marcus as uncooperative. Jordan couldn't believe the lengths they were willing to go. "They're doubling down," he told Claire during a late-night strategy session. "They'd rather protect their image than admit they were wrong." "That's why we need to keep pushing," Claire replied. "The more they resist, the more obvious their guilt becomes." The pressure on the department increased as more whistleblowers came forward. A young officer named Rebecca Turner, who had only been on the force for 3 years, testified about the toxic culture she had witnessed. "I joined to make a difference," Rebecca said, her voice steadied despite the tension in the room. "But I quickly realized that the rules were different for certain officers. Complaints against them disappeared. It didn't matter if they were in the wrong. The department always had their back." Her testimony was a turning point, casting doubt on the defense's claims that Ridley's actions were an isolated mistake. Jordan steps into the spotlight. On the 5th day of the trial, Claire called Jordan to the stand. He wasn't just a plaintiff. He was the emotional core of the case, a son fighting for his father. Jordan recounted his father's life with passion and precision, describing the values Marcus had instilled in him: integrity, resilience, and the belief that standing up for what's right was worth any cost. "My father is a man who taught me to respect the law," Jordan said, his voice unwavering. "But he also taught me that the law must respect us in return. What happened to him isn't just a violation of his rights. It's a betrayal of everything he stood for." Wallace cross-examined him, trying to portray Jordan as a biased son driven by emotion rather than facts. But Jordan held his ground, countering each question with calm, reasoned answers. The turning tide. As the trial progressed, the community outside the courthouse grew larger. What started as a local protest had transformed into a national movement, with activists, celebrities, and everyday citizens joining the call for justice. The media frenzy put immense pressure on the mayor and city officials. In a desperate attempt to contain the fallout, the police chief announced his resignation, claiming it was time for new leadership. But the community wasn't satisfied with symbolic gestures. They wanted systemic change. The power of unity. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Jordan stepped outside to find a vigil being held for Marcus. Hundreds of people stood in the cold, holding candles and singing. Children from the youth center held signs that read, "Get well soon, Uncle Marcus," and "We believe in justice." Jordan was overwhelmed by the sight. These weren't just his father's friends and neighbors. They were people from all walks of life, united by a shared belief in accountability and fairness. Taking the microphone, Jordan addressed the crowd. "This fight isn't just about my father," he said, his voice strong despite the lump in his throat. "It's about every person who has ever been told their life doesn't matter. It's about proving that justice isn't just an ideal. It's a responsibility." The tipping point. As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense began to falter. The weight of the evidence, the testimonies, and the growing public outcry made it impossible to ignore the systemic issues at play. Claire delivered a powerful closing argument, reminding the jury that their decision would echo far beyond the courtroom. "You have the power to send a message," she said. "A message that no one is above the law, and that justice is not a privilege, it's a right." When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension was palpable. Jordan sat with Claire, his hands clasped tightly as he waited for the verdict. Whatever happened next, he knew this was just the beginning. The fight for his father had grown into a fight for something much bigger, a fight for change. The courtroom felt heavier as the days wore on, each side presenting arguments that raised the stakes higher. The jurors were visibly weary, their faces unreadable as they absorbed the mountain of evidence and testimony. But outside the courthouse, the fight for justice was gaining unstoppable momentum. Behind closed doors. One evening, Jordan sat with Claire and the legal team, sifting through documents and preparing for the next day's cross-examinations. The atmosphere was tense, but focused. Maria Delgado had just finished testifying, and her account of suppressed complaints had shaken the courtroom. "I think we've got them rattled," Claire said, reviewing notes. "Their cross-examination strategy is getting sloppier." Jordan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Maria mentioned something in her testimony. An officer named Grant who filed a complaint that vanished. Why haven't we heard from him? Claire looked up, intrigued. "He's probably another casualty of their protect the blue culture. We need to find him." With renewed urgency, Jordan reached out to his network of contacts. Through a mutual connection, he tracked down Officer Grant, a former sergeant who had left the department after years of frustration. A whistleblower emerges. Jordan met Grant at a small cafe on the edge of town. The man looked like he had aged decades in a few years, his eyes sunken and his hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. "Thanks for meeting me," Jordan began cautiously. "I know this isn't easy." Grant sighed. "I've been carrying this weight for too long. I can't stay silent anymore." For the next hour, Grant detailed his experience in the department, echoing many of the issues Maria had described. But he also revealed something new, an internal email chain discussing Marcus Harris's case. "They're trying to frame this as a justified use of force," Grant said, sliding a folder across the table. "But these emails show how they coordinated the cover-up." Jordan opened the folder, his breath catching as he read the documents. The emails included directives to manipulate witness statements, pressure the district attorney's office, and prepare a defense narrative for the media. It was a smoking gun, a clear indication that the department's corruption wasn't just systemic, it was deliberate. "This is exactly what we need," Jordan said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and relief. "Will you testify?" Grant hesitated. "I've already lost so much. My job, my reputation. But if it means justice for your father and others like him, I'll do it." The courtroom showdown. The next day, Grant took the stand, his testimony delivering a seismic blow to the defense. The courtroom was silent as he described the internal pressures to conform and the retaliation he faced for speaking out. "Officer Ridley wasn't acting alone," Grant said, his voice steady. "He was protected by a culture that values loyalty over accountability." Wallace attempted to discredit Grant, suggesting that he was a disgruntled former employee with a vendetta. But Claire countered with the email evidence, walking the jury through each incriminating message. The weight of the documents was undeniable, leaving the defense scrambling to recover. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as news of Grant's testimony spread. The protests had evolved into a full-blown movement, complete with organized marches, speeches, and even a national fundraiser to support victims of police brutality. The system strikes back. As the trial gained traction, the defense resorted to desperate measures. They leaked personal information about Marcus, digging into his past to find anything that could paint him in a negative light. Old parking tickets and minor infractions were blown out of proportion in an attempt to sway public opinion. Jordan was furious but unsurprised. "This is what they do," he told Claire. "They can't argue the facts, so they attack the person." "We expected this," Claire replied calmly. "The jury isn't dumb. They'll see through it." But the attacks took a toll on Marcus's supporters. Some of the community members who had been outspoken began to waver, fearful of becoming targets themselves. Jordan knew he had to step up to keep the momentum going. A rallying cry. That evening, Jordan organized a town hall meeting at the community center where his father had worked. The room was packed, standing room only, as people came to hear updates on the trial and show their support. Jordan stood at the podium, his voice steadied despite the weight of the moment. "They're trying to divide us," he said, looking out at the crowd. "They want us to believe that this fight isn't worth it. But every time we stand together, we prove them wrong." He gestured toward a mural on the wall, a painting of Marcus surrounded by the kids he mentored. "My father believed in this community. He believed that we're stronger when we lift each other up. And right now, we need to lift each other up more than ever." The crowd erupted into applause, their spirits reignited. People began sharing their own stories of resilience and solidarity, transforming the meeting into a celebration of community strength. The final blow. The trial's climax came when the prosecution presented the email evidence. Claire methodically walked the jury through the timeline, connecting the dots between Ridley's actions and the department's cover-up. She ended her presentation with a powerful statement. "This case isn't just about Marcus Harris. It's about every person who has been silenced, every community that has been ignored, and every system that has failed to protect the people it serves. You have the power to change that. The question is, will you?" Wallace's closing argument was strong, but it lacked the weight of truth. He leaned heavily on emotional appeals, claiming that holding the department accountable would destroy the fabric of law enforcement. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable. When they finally returned, the four persons stood, holding the verdict in their hands. A movement grows. The verdict would change everything, not just for Marcus Harris, but for a nation watching closely. But whether it was a victory or another setback, one thing was clear. Jordan and his community had already won in another way. They had exposed the truth, rallied a movement, and laid the foundation for lasting change, redemption, and reckoning. The courtroom was still as the foreperson of the jury stood, holding the verdict in hand. Jordan Harris felt the world around him narrow to a single point, his breath caught in his chest. Months of relentless effort, nights without sleep, and the unyielding pain of seeing his father in a coma had led to this moment. The community had rallied, The evidence had been presented, and the nation had watched. Now, it all came down to 12 strangers. In the matter of Harris versus the Crescent Heights Police Department, the foreperson began, their voice steady but somber. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the room erupted in emotion. Cheers burst from the gallery where Marcus's friends, supporters, and community members sat. Tears streamed down faces, and people embraced one another. Jordan sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table as the words sank in. They had won. Justice had prevailed, not just for his father, but for every person who had been silenced or ignored. The weight of a verdict. The court awarded significant damages to Marcus Harris and his family, but the monetary figure was secondary to what the victory represented. The jury's decision carried a powerful message. The system could no longer protect those who abused their authority. Accountability was not optional. Officer Ridley was visibly shaken as the verdict was read. His attorney whispered in his ear, but he didn't respond. For the first time, the man who had acted with such impunity looked small, like the weight of his actions had finally reached him. Jordan stood and turned to the crowd. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The applause and cheers were enough to say everything that needed to be said. As he stepped outside the courthouse, he was met with a sea of supporters. The streets were filled with people holding signs, chanting, and singing. "You did it," someone shouted, and Jordan smiled faintly. "We did it," he corrected. A father's awakening. 2 days after the verdict, Jordan sat beside his father's hospital bed. Marcus had been in a coma for weeks, his condition stable but unchanging. Jordan had made it a habit to visit him every day, reading aloud from the news or recounting the latest developments in the trial. He believed, deep down, that his father could hear him. "Dad," Jordan said softly, holding Marcus's hand, "we won. The jury sided with us. The world knows the truth now." As he spoke, a small twitch of movement caught his eye. Marcus's fingers curled slightly around Jordan's hand. Jordan froze, unsure if he'd imagined it. Then it happened again. "Dad?" he whispered, leaning closer. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but alive. Jordan's heart swelled as he called for the nurse, tears streaming down his face. Marcus was back. The road to recovery. Marcus's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy sessions became part of his daily routine, and though his body was weak, his spirit remained unbroken. When he learned about the trial and the community's support, he was overwhelmed. "They stood up for me," Marcus asked one day, his voice still raspy from disuse. "They stood up for all of us," Jordan replied. "You inspired them, Dad. You gave them the courage to fight." Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening. "Then we can't stop here. Rebuilding a community." The verdict was just the beginning. Jordan and Marcus knew that real change required more than a single courtroom victory. They began working with local leaders to create initiatives aimed at reforming the police department. One of their first actions was establishing the Marcus Harris Foundation, dedicated to providing legal support for victims of injustice and funding community programs that fostered trust between law enforcement and residents. The youth center where Marcus had volunteered became the foundation's headquarters, its walls adorned with murals depicting scenes of unity and resilience. Jordan also worked with lawmakers to propose new legislation mandating independent oversight of police departments. The bill, named the Harris Act, quickly gained traction, propelled by the national attention surrounding Marcus's case. Ridley's reckoning. Meanwhile, Officer Ridley faced his own day in court. With the civil trial concluded, the district attorney announced criminal charges against him, including aggravated assault and misconduct in office. The evidence from Jordan's case, combined with testimony from other victims, made the case against Ridley strong. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Ridley requested a meeting with Marcus and Jordan. Against Claire's advice, they agreed, curious to hear what he had to say. Ridley sat across from them in a sterile conference room, his hands fidgeting nervously. "I don't expect forgiveness," he began, his voice subdued. "What I did was wrong. I see that now." Marcus studied him for a long moment before speaking. "It's not about forgiveness. It's about accountability. Do you understand the harm you've caused? Not just to me, but to this entire community." Ridley nodded, tears in his eyes. "I do, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." Whether his remorse was genuine or born of desperation, Marcus and Jordan couldn't be sure, but it didn't change their mission. Justice wasn't about vengeance. It was about ensuring no one else suffered the way they had. A new beginning. Months later, Marcus stood on a stage at a community event, a cane in one hand and a microphone in the other. Beside him, Jordan beamed with pride. The crowd was larger than anyone had anticipated, a testament to the movement they had inspired. "Justice isn't a destination," Marcus said, his voice strong despite his injuries. "It's a journey. And it's one we take together, step by step, hand in hand." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers carrying the weight of hope and determination. As Marcus looked out at the faces before him, he saw the future, a community united, stronger than ever, ready to continue the fight for equality and fairness. Jordan placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We're just getting started," he said. Marcus nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Let's keep going." A new beginning. 6 months after the landmark verdict, Crescent Heights had transformed. The once quiet Midwest town had become a symbol of resilience and change, its streets bustling with activists, journalists, and reformers eager to learn from its hard-earned lessons. Yet for Jordan and Marcus Harris, the fight was far from over. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but systemic change was a mountain that would take years to climb. A movement grows. The Marcus Harris Foundation had gained national attention, quickly becoming a beacon for victims of police misconduct and systemic injustice. Donations poured in from across the country, allowing the foundation to expand its operations. Marcus and Jordan worked tirelessly, organizing town halls, community workshops, and legal aid clinics. Jordan found himself thrust into a new role, not just as an advocate, but as a leader of a growing movement. His speeches at rallies and conferences drew massive crowds, his words resonating far beyond Crescent Heights. "We're not just fighting for justice for my father," Jordan declared at a rally in Chicago. "We're fighting for a world where no father, no mother, no child has to endure what my family did." Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with us. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unison. Justice now. Justice for all. A family united. Back in Crescent Heights, Marcus's recovery continued. Physical therapy was grueling, but Marcus faced it with the same determination that had carried him through his military service. His cane became a symbol, not of weakness, but of resilience. One afternoon, Marcus sat in the park with Jordan, watching children play on the swings. It was the same park where Marcus had often mentored kids from the youth center, a place filled with memories of laughter and learning. "You've done more than I ever imagined," Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Jordan smiled, his chest tightening at the mention of his late mother. She had been the glue that held their family together, and he carried her lessons in his heart every day. "I learned it all from you and Mom," Jordan replied. "This fight is as much hers as it is ours." They sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared journey hanging between them like an invisible thread. It wasn't just their personal fight anymore. It had become a fight for everyone. The ripple effect. The verdict in Marcus's case sparked a wave of changes across the country. Other victims of police brutality found the courage to come forward, inspired by the Harris family's determination. Whistleblowers in other cities began exposing corruption within their own departments, leading to investigations and reforms. In Washington, D.C., the Harris Act, proposed by Jordan and a coalition of lawmakers, gained bipartisan support. The bill mandated independent oversight of police departments, stricter accountability measures, and mandatory de-escalation training for officers. It also established a national database of complaints against law enforcement to prevent problem officers from moving between jurisdictions undetected. The Harris Act passed with overwhelming support, hailed as one of the most significant police reform bills in decades. At the signing ceremony, Jordan stood beside the president, his heart swelling with pride as he watched the legislation become law. "This is for you, Dad," he whispered, clutching the small pin the president handed him as a keepsake. Healing the divide. While progress was being made on a national scale, Crescent Heights still faced its own challenges. The police department was under new leadership, with Chief Rebecca Turner, the young officer who had testified against her peers, now at the helm. Chief Turner wasted no time implementing reforms, including community policing initiatives and transparent disciplinary procedures. But change wasn't easy. Many officers resisted the new policies, clinging to the old ways out of fear or loyalty to the past. Community trust, though improving, was still fragile. Marcus and Jordan worked closely with Chief Turner to bridge the gap. They organized forums where officers and residents could share their experiences and concerns openly. The sessions were tense at first, with heated arguments and deep-seated grievances surfacing. But over time, they began to foster understanding. At one forum, an older black man stood and addressed the room. "I've been stopped more times than I can count," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But tonight, for the first time, I feel like someone's listening." An officer seated nearby nodded. "And for the first time," the officer said, "I'm hearing what it's like to be on the other side." Ridley's trial. Meanwhile, Officer Ridley faced his criminal trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and after weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty on all charges. Ridley was sentenced to 8 years in prison, a punishment that sent a clear message: no one is above the law. While many celebrated the verdict, Marcus viewed it with quiet contemplation. "Justice isn't about putting people in prison," he told Jordan one evening. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. We got a long road ahead, a legacy of hope." The story of Marcus and Jordan Harris became a national touchstone, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a movie. But for the Harris family, the true legacy was in the lives they touched. The kids at the youth center saw Marcus as a hero, not just for surviving his ordeal, but for using it to create change. One day, a young boy approached Marcus at the center, clutching a sketchbook. "I drew this for you," he said shyly. Marcus opened the book to find a drawing of himself, standing tall with his cane, surrounded by smiling faces. At the top, the boy had written, "Thank you for being our hero." Marcus's throat tightened as he looked at the boy. "The real heroes," he said, "are people like you. You're the future." The journey continues. As the sun set over Crescent Heights, Marcus and Jordan stood together on the steps of the youth center, watching the community they had fought so hard for come alive with possibility. Families gathered in the park, kids played basketball, and volunteers worked on a new mural depicting scenes of hope and unity. "This isn't the end," Jordan said, his voice steady. Marcus nodded, a small smile on his lips. "No, son, it's just the beginning." Together, they walked into the center, ready to continue their mission. The fight for justice wasn't over, but they knew they weren't alone. Their story had become a spark, and that spark had ignited a fire that would burn brightly for generations to come. The Harris legacy had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unyielding power of standing up for what is right. And in every corner of the country, their message resonated: change is possible, but it starts with us.